Well, we'll come to the time now where we'll look at a passage from the Bible. We'll talk about what it means, why this matters, and what we should do about it. So if you have a Bible, would you turn to 1 Samuel 25? If you're using this Brown Pew Bible, it's page 209. 1 Samuel 25, and when you found that, would you stand together with me and we'll read this passage. It's a longer passage, so we're going to kind of hop through it a bit, but I believe in you. I believe you can do it. So as you're able, would you stand and let's read together. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Maon, and a certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy, and he had 1,000 goats, 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, the Calebite, was surly and mean in his dealings. While David was in the desert, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable towards my young men. Since we come at a festive time, please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them.' When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name, and then they waited, which makes it sound a little bit like they're giving this message through like a gate intercom or something. They just kind of wait now that they've said it. Nabal answered David's servants, 'Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread, my water, the meat I have slaughtered from my shearers, and give it to men coming from who knows where?' David's men turned around and went back. And when they arrived and reported every word, David said to his men, 'Put on your swords.' So they put on their swords, and David put on his. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. Now, while this is going on, one of Nabal's servants comes to his wife, Abigail, and is like, 'You better do something quick. Our boss has screwed up big time, and there's a disaster's about to come on our house. Do something. We can't talk to him. Just do something to help.' And so Abigail, she's a wise woman. Right away, first thing, she sends off a huge provision. She takes all this stuff that would have been prepared for this big feast they're about to have, sends off a portion to David and his men ahead. Then she told her servants, 'Go ahead.' She sends off these provisions. 'I'll follow you.' But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding on her donkey into the mountain ravine, there was David and his men descending towards her, and she met them. David had just said, 'It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the desert, so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all that belonged to him.' When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey, bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, 'My lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. May the Lord pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name is fool, and folly goes with him. But as for me, your servant, I did not see the man my master sent. Now, since the Lord has kept you, my master, from bloodshed, and from avenging yourself with your own hands, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, may your enemies and all who intend to harm my master be like Nabal. And let this gift be which your servant has brought to my master be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's offense, for the Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my master, because he fights the Lord's battles. Let no wrongdoing be found in you as long as you live, even though someone is pursuing you to take your life." Okay, so she knows about Saul chasing after him. "The life of my master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God, but the lives of your enemies he will hurl away from you as from the pocket of a sling." She's heard about David and Goliath as well. When the Lord has made for my master every good thing he promised concerning him, and he has appointed him leader over Israel, my master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed, or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord has brought my master success, remember your servant. David said to Abigail, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. Then David accepted from her hands what she had brought him and said, go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request. Abigail, she leaves, she heads back home to see the celebration is in full swing. Her husband's prepared a banquet for a king, and he's drunk out of his mind. And so she decides to leave and not say anything until the next day when he's sobered up. And when she tells him what she's done, God's word says he basically has a heart attack. He has some kind of a physical reaction where he's laid out, and 10 days later, God takes his life. Verse 39, when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, praise be to the Lord who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head. As the story goes, David then takes in Abigail to be his own wife. I'd like to say the story is happily ever after from there, but it's not. But this is God's word and what we're looking at today. You may be seated. Thanks for your endurance there with that long reading. Let me take a moment and just pray for us and ask God's blessing as we come to his word now. Spirit of God, we invite you once again to be present here as you have been already so powerfully this morning. Would you speak to us through your word, which we believe you inspired men to write centuries ago. This is a living word because it was written by your living Spirit who lives in so many of us today and is present here. Would you speak powerfully through this in exactly the way we need to hear it? Would you impress on us exactly what our hearts need to hear? Change us in the ways we need to be changed, God. You tell us in your word, when you send out your word, it doesn't return to you void. It will accomplish the purpose for which you sent it. Oh God, accomplish that purpose in each one of us today. And as I always ask, eternal God, now move and govern my tongue to speak your truth. Amen. Well, I want you to try to imagine a scene with me where a loving father, let's just call him Mr. Jones, he one day wants to bless his kids as well as the whole surrounding community of this neighborhood where he lives with a new play place for them all to enjoy. And because he's a man of significant financial means, what he builds for them is this amazing, epic, like treetop adventure land. It's like something out of Star Wars in an Ewok village. You've got like sleeping areas. There's lookouts for them to go to. There's suspension bridges. It's this incredible gifts that he builds for them. And when he reveals his creation to the kids, one day when it's done, they understandably lose their minds with gratitude. Just like, wow, are you kidding me? You were the most amazing dad ever, going on and on. Like, our dad is amazing. This is an amazing gift that you've created for us. And God, he's like, yes, this is my gift for all of you. I want you to enjoy. The kids are obviously excited. But when Mr. Jones wakes up the next morning to the sound of the doorbell, he comes to the front door and his whole front yard is like filled with like 20 plus kids all standing there. And one of them says, would it be all right if we play in the play place as well? And he's like, yes, of course. I've made this for all of you. And then one of the kids comes up to him with his cell phone and shows him a picture where the front gate that goes into the play place has a padlock on it, and there's a sign on the door that says, sorry, for Jones kids only. Now, already this is bad enough. Already this is a bad scene, but just imagine now that in response, the father just loses his mind. He storms out into the backyard, grabs a chainsaw from the garage, fires it up, and starts walking towards the base of the trees. It's a scene that's about to go from bad to much, 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 much worse. And the only thing that saves Mr. Jones from huge destruction and probably a criminal record as well is Mrs. Jones, who has heard all the commotion and comes out just in the nick of time, stands between the father and the trees, and produces a large pair of bolt cutters that she got from the garage. Probably the better way to go. We are continuing this series this morning entitled After God's Own Heart, looking at the life of a man named David, which we have written for us here in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel in the Old Testament. A man the Bible itself describes this way, after God's own heart. And although, I don't know if you were here last week, what we saw last week was David displaying this incredible restraint when he has the opportunity to kill Saul. Remember this man who's been chasing him all through the desert. He's in the cave. He has a chance to kill him. Instead, he offers him grace. He sets him free. What we see today here is a very different side of David. It's one of the first clear examples of the numerous scenes we have in his life that make the Bible's description of David as a man after God's own heart much more difficult for us to reconcile. We're just like, really? For just as we saw in the story that I began with about this treetop adventure land, although the circumstances that provoke David's anger are just, his response to that injustice is way over the top. Way over the top. And it's dangerous not only to Nabal's household, but also to David himself. And so one of the key things that we're going to learn from our passage today is that to remain after God's own heart, to remain a man or woman after God's own heart, will very often require the help of others. It's going to require those whom God's going to send to help us, to redirect our hearts and the orientation of our hearts back towards God when they have begun to stray. Just simply to say it this way, no one remains after God's own heart on their own. In order to help us see how God uses one of his people to help redirect David's heart, to remain his heart, to remain after God's own heart, and how we can learn how God does the very same thing today in our lives. In order to help us remain after God's own heart with the help of others, I want to look at our passage here together in just two ways. I want to show you David's just expectation and then Abigail's saving intercession. David's just expectation, Abigail's saving intercession. So if you closed your Bibles, would you open them again to that passage, 1 Samuel 25. Follow along with me as we look at this next scene in the life of David, a man after God's own heart. Okay, so let's look first of all at David's just expectation. David's just expectation. Now, when we come to verse 1 of chapter 25 here, we learn that the prophet Samuel has died, which, as we see here, this is a really significant event for all the people of Israel. But as the one who had anointed David to be the next king over Israel, the one who was David's really spiritual life mentor, the guy that he met often with, it's easy to see that his death would have a particularly impactful meaning for David. Now, is this something that continues to weigh heavily on David's heart and mind, exhausting his emotional reserves? And so maybe that's why we see David acting in such an uncharacteristic manner? The Bible doesn't say. But what we do know is that the event of Samuel's death is one of the things that leads David to move down to the desert of Moab, where he comes into contact with this guy Nabal, a wealthy sheep farmer, or at least with his shepherds and his huge flocks. And as we read this report here that David's men give to Nabal in verse 7, the beginning of verse 8, and then the report that the shepherds give to Nabal's wife in verse 15 and 16, what we learn is that David and his men are being really just like this night and day security force, just watching over this whole operation so that neither raiders, thieves, wild animals, all really common threats in this time period, harmed either the sheep or the shepherds until they could come up to this harvest time. If you see in verse 16 in particular, the shepherds are talking to Nabal's wife Abigail, and they say, night and day, they were a wall around us. All the time we were herding our sheep near them. Now I know, We're in Vancouver, okay? So if any of us have any sheep herding knowledge, probably not. So another thing that's important to note here, they keep talking about the sheep shearing time. Something that's important to know is that what that is basically like harvest time for somebody who's a sheep herder. This is the time when they'll bring in the crop of wool in this case, and the farmer is now going to see what his profit is going to be for the whole year. This whole field, that's his bank account. And he's bringing it in and out to harvest, and he's going to see how much wealth that's going to be. And generally speaking, as verse 8 and verse 36 clearly indicate, generally speaking, this is a time of great celebration, feasting, as the huge paycheck comes in, and they all celebrate. And this, obviously, Nabal, it said he had 1,000 goats, 3,000 sheep. This is going to be a big celebration, right? Which altogether is the reason David, he sees no issue whatsoever sending just a small delegation from his army to ask for a portion of all that would have already been prepared for this huge celebration. The party is, he knows it's happening. He's just like, hey, can we have a small portion of that for my men here? And although he doesn't say it explicitly, the clear implication of what David's report is he's saying is like, well, like a big reason you're able to have this abundant feast at all is because my men have been watching over your stuff. We've been protecting your stuff for night and day these last months so that you can have this big celebration. And honestly, there's all kinds of different ideas about what David is doing here. If you look at his ask in verse 8, look there with me. There's no manipulation. There's no extortion here. He's not handing Nabal like an invoice, like, well, listen, that's 600 men, 12-hour rotating shifts, extra time and a half for overtime. We got to get RSP and health He's not doing that. He's not doing anything like that. He just says, please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. Just a small portion to help us out in what we've been helping you. Seems entirely just, doesn't it? But what that does is it provides the setting for the profound shock and provocation that David's men felt, and we likely felt as well as we read this. When you get to verse 10 and you read Nabal's foolish reply to David's entirely just expectation. Look at verse 10 and 11. Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their master these days. Why should I take my bread, my water, the meat I have slaughtered from my shears and give it to men who come from who knows where? And of course, well beyond risking the wrath of 600 warriors out in the desert, not to mention the fact of insulting the future king of Israel, what makes Nabal's reply so foolish is that he completely ignores the reality that all the things here that he's calling mine, they're only his because of the grace and protection of the very person he's denying. You wouldn't have any of this stuff that you're calling mine right now if it wasn't for me and the way that I watched over it, protected it. Incredibly foolish. But here's the thing. Before we, Nabal, just can shake our head at Nabal, I think I'd be doing a huge disservice to all of us if we didn't just stop here for a second and consider whether or not to one degree or another, if the foolishness of Nabal isn't present within every single one of us. Isn't it? Isn't it? For although the consistent teaching of the Bible from Genesis all the way to the book of Revelation is that the earth and everything in it is God's. It belongs to Him. That as Abraham Kuyper famously wrote, there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. Think about it. My time, my money, my house, my clothes, my food. How'd you get here today? My car, my kids, all of those things, listen, remain not just the consistent language we use to describe those things, but our consistent belief. Those things are mine. It's mine. That's in all of us. We're told numerous times in this chapter that the name Nabal means fool. Do you know what one of the ways the Bible describes foolishness? Living as if there is no God. living like God isn't the sovereign ruler and owner of all things, which means, hear me, Nabal's problem isn't that he has a generosity problem. Nabal's problem is that he's got a worship problem. And that's because his hope, his joy, his security, even his salvation is not found in the God who made the heavens and the earth and who knit Nabal together in his mother's womb. It's found in his wealth and in his possessions. Those are Nabal's gods. Those are the things he worships, which is why he finds it so impossible to give even a small portion away to anyone. You know, we don't teach a lot on giving in the church anymore these days. We don't really talk about it. I understand some of the reasons and fears associated with that. There's always this fear for every pastor. Anytime you talk about giving, that all of a sudden we worry that people are going to think, oh yeah, the church is just about money. That's what the church is about. They're just out to get our money. And so because of that, so often pastors are like, well, we probably shouldn't talk about it. I don't want people to think that. We'll just kind of hope that people understand this. And yet, think about this. How crazy is this that as your pastor, I would stand up here Sunday after Sunday, teach you, encourage you, every other form of worship, and yet neglect this one area of worship, which we all probably have the greatest tendency of all to withhold from God. It's crazy to me that we would do that I would surrender and not, as Paul said, bring the whole counsel of God to you in the way that I teach. So can we do this? Can we take a few minutes? We're going to do it. And give us like basic 101 teaching. What does the Bible teach us about worship through giving? Maybe this is something you've never heard in your life. I don't know. What does the Bible teach us baseline as it relates to worship through giving? Very simply, this is not going to be everything, but the first foundational principle of this that we begin with is that everything in your life that you call mine is actually God's. Everything that you call mine is God's gift to you to manage, to steward. That's what he's done. Now, I've said this to a few of you over the years. I feel like I kind of have an unfair advantage over a lot of people when it comes to this belief, not because I'm a pastor, but because the home that I currently live in isn't mine. I didn't purchase it. The home that I live in right now belongs to the church. So it's way easier, I think, for me to get my head around the idea that I could be given something to manage and to steward, but that doesn't actually belong to me. And yet, that's just one aspect. That's just one thing I need to see that way. The point for you and I is that we need to have that belief about everything. Everything, our house, my car, my money, my family, all those things, we need to believe and live in such a way that says none of these things belongs to me. They are only God's gifts to me to steward. All of them. And when you have that foundational belief, then you move from there to the foundational principle that the God who made everything and owns everything also gave everything in order to redeem you from your slavery to sin and death, to adopt you as his son or daughter. Classic text we always go to would be John 3:16. God so loved the world, he gave his only son. He gave everything he had in order that all who believe in him might not perish but have everlasting life. Paul says it this way in 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that although he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. And then finally, and listen, only with those foundations in place can you then rightly consider the question of how much you're willing to return to God in your worship. And I'm saying that way very intentionally. How much of all God has given you, you're willing to return to him in worship. Now, the very general principle given to us throughout the Bible as a baseline of giving is that we would offer back to God 10% of everything that we earn. That's the kind of the baseline principle that people kind of use as their guide to go with. Some of you are like, 10%, are you crazy? And others of you are saying, 10%, that's it. Whatever, that's a baseline to start from. That we would offer back to God 10% of all that we've earned. Now, if you have kids or you've been around kids, you've seen this thing that they do sometimes, especially when they're very young. They're trying to learn gift giving. And so they'll take something that's yours wrap it up and put it under the tree, give it to you for your birthday, and you got to be like, you can't give me my cell phone for Christmas. Like, I mean, I've been looking for this. Thank you. But they don't quite get it, and yet I'm using this language very intentionally. Offer back to God in worship, because in a very real sense, that's what we do when we give to God. You're offering back to Him really just a portion of what's already His, and yet He's pleased with it. He's pleased with it. Why? Not giving back to Him so that He'll love you. That's not why we give to God. We're not saying, how much do I have to give so that I'll have your acceptance? No, we're giving to Him because He's shown He already does. This is our grateful act of thanksgiving to Him, and not at all doing it so that we believe that God needs our money. Oh, we got to meet the bottom line, people. There's no thermometer on the stage here. We've already taken our offering. It's not what we're doing here. We don't give God our money because He needs it, but because offering back a small portion to God of all that He's entrusted you to manage. What you're saying week after week, contrary to Nabal, is that this what I'm giving is not my God. You are. We're saying, God, all that I have is yours, and my joy, my hope, my security is not in the number on my bank account statement. It's in you. That's where my security is found. That's where my hope and joy is found. So maybe, I don't know if this is the first time you've ever heard teaching like this or anything about this, and if it is, and you're feeling like, man, I don't know where I'm at, the solution, let me tell you, is not to just say, oh, you got to put a bunch of money in the offering. No. It's not actually. The solution is to go home this week, and if you're single, sit down with yourself. If you're married, sit down with your spouse. Look at your finances and say, does our giving reflect our worship to God? That's what we should really do. That's what would truly please God if you take anything out of this. That your giving would reflect your worship and your understanding of these foundational principles. All we have is His. He has given all in order to redeem us. And then give as a principle of how it is that we want to worship Him, return back what He's given. Principally, I believe this is at least one of the key things we're being shown in this first part of the passage. That just as David was completely just in expecting a portion of Nabal's shearing celebration because of the key part he'd had in that celebration even happening, so our God is worthy of that portion of your harvest. When you understand Him to be the owner and the giver of everything that you call mine. Okay, you made it. You made it through. Good. That's David's just expectation. Last thing I want to show you from our passage is Abigail's saving intercession. Abigail's saving intercession. And this is the part of the story that really kind of just goes sideways for a lot of us as we're studying the life of David here. Because last week, remember, David had this chance to carry out justice, kill the one who's hunting him across the entire desert, take the easy shortcut to the throne, and he doesn't. He displays this incredible restraint, offering Saul grace and leaving justice into God's hands. He says that God's going to be the judge, and yet now, look at verse 13, he's more than ready to carry out vengeance on someone who's wronged him. He's ready to go to war. Look at verse, then over to 22. He says, may God deal with David ever so severely if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. Like he's ready to go kill everybody now. And so it's like he's a completely different person all of a sudden. Is this the same David we're talking about? It is. And just to be very clear, if you listen close to Abigail's intercession, as God places it on her heart to go to him and try to divert David's wrath, her description of what David intends to do to Nabal is anything but righteous. What David has in his heart to do here is wrong. It's evil. It's something not at all that God would have someone who's after his own heart carry out. And there's all kinds of theories as to why David is doing this, why he's acting this way. Perhaps he simply sees Nabal as, he's a wealthy landowner, but he's nowhere near the status of someone like Saul, God's anointed. And so he doesn't feel maybe he deserves the same level of restraint. Maybe, as I mentioned earlier, maybe David is just physically and emotionally drained from running for his life all this time, his spiritual mentor and friend has died, and he just doesn't have the reserves to properly evaluate this personal slight from a foolish Nabal. But whatever the reason, the Bible doesn't tell us, explicitly anyway, I think the ultimate reason David responds like this is because he has a sinful heart. He has a sinful heart just like you, just like me, and like we've been saying from the beginning of this time. Listen, being after God's own heart doesn't mean obeying God perfectly. That's one of the great blessings we're learning from this. Being after God's own heart does not mean a life of sinless perfection. Thank God it doesn't. Because none of you do, and neither do I. And so as David surrenders to his anger in this moment of weakness and allows the orientation of his heart to divert from God to personal vengeance, mercifully, God sends Abigail to intercede for her household in a way that saves them and preserves David's conscience and his future reign as king from being unnecessarily burdened by blood guilt, by the shedding of innocent blood. And as you follow the narrative here from verse 14 and onward, Abigail she's informed about what her husband has done, and true to her description in verse 3 of being as intelligent as she is beautiful, she leaps into action to prevent this needless ruin from falling on her household, first of all, by sending ahead the provisions that her foolish husband should have sent in the first place. She's like, just take this and get it there now. And then secondly, unwilling to just simply wait and see how this kind of turns out, she puts herself directly in harm's way here, goes out to face the oncoming judgment herself. And if you look at verse 24, where she finally meets up with David and his army, the very first action that she does is to humble herself. She bows down on her face and takes the blame for Nabal's foolish actions upon herself. See there, she says, let the blame be on me alone. And as you keep reading, you see this powerfully beautiful display of intercession where Abigail speaks God's truth again and again over David's wrath. She becomes like a lid put on a pot of oil that's caught on fire and just snuffs the energy out of his wrath. And God uses her intercession to calm David, to bring him back to his senses, and to redirect his heart back towards his God, and so that all are saved. As you can plainly see, this is what happens. This is what her intercession is successful. Because where moments before David is calling down curses in God's name, when you get to verse 32, he has returned to blessing in God's name. See, he says to her, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to me today. May you be blessed for your good judgment, for keeping me from bloodshed this day, avenging myself with my own hands. And finally, look at the second half of verse 35. He's able to say to her now, go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request. A day that was about to go very bad is saved because of Abigail's intercession. And as I said when we began this morning, let me say it again. What this part of our passage clearly demonstrates, no one remains after God's own heart on their own. And we need each other. We need each other. Even the one who the Bible says is after God's own heart doesn't remain after God's own heart on his own. He needs these people who will come in and be like, whoa, just let's think about this. Every person who desires to remain after God's own heart themselves has this very same need for the help of others. For those who will courageously face your passionate pursuits away from God's heart that we're all prone to, whether that's a pursuit of greed, of lust, of rage, of pride, whatever it is, that they'll stand in that gap, speak God's truth over you, calming the fires of sinful passion and redirecting the orientation of your heart back to God. Do you have people in your life like this? Do you have any Abigails in your life right now? Is there anyone who will courageously stand in the path of your foolish pursuits and willingly face your wrath with the hope of speaking the truth you already know back to you, redirecting your heart back to God? Man, we need these people. I know they can seem so frustrating and annoying in the moment as they're doing it. I know that. And there's no question that listen, none of us are likely to do this as well as Abigail does here. Probably not. You can't expect that it's going to look perfect like this. But I'm praying that the transforming power of her intercession in the life of David might give you new eyes to see the Abigails in your own life, not as a bother, but as a blessing directly from God's hand. But I pray this is also a hope-filled encouragement to any Abigails in here today who are wondering if their intercession can truly make a difference. That it would encourage you to continue to call out those that you love, bring God's truth to them in their hell-bent pursuit away from God's heart. The hope of this passage is that by God's grace, the voice of a single Abigail can divert the destruction of an entire army. So don't give up. Don't stop your intercession. Don't stop speaking the truth to those whose ears might seem deaf to those calls right now. I'm standing here today. I know myself. I'm one of the many who are where I am today because of some precious Abigails that didn't give up interceding for me. And my guess is that's your story too. And of course, even more than any of this, what we also see here in Abigail's story is a beautiful reenactment of the gospel. As she points us to the one who left the glories and riches of his home in order to intercede on behalf of one who is not worthy, in order to intercede on one who is completely undeserving of such grace, so that we might return to our Father's home in peace. But whereas Abigail diverts vengeance that is unjust, this one turns aside the completely just wrath of the Father against our sinful rebellion. The Bible's word that it uses is propitiation, the one who turns aside the just wrath of God. But he diverts the attention, redirecting it, not by just turning it aside like this, but by absorbing it in himself. He absorbs the wrath into himself on the cross as Jesus willingly stood between God's just wrath against us and our sin and said, "Let the blame be on me alone." And then was crushed under the weight of it. Prophet Isaiah says it this way: "Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. And by his wounds we are healed." In light of such unfathomable grace and mercy from our true and better Abigail, is there anything you could really withhold from him in your worship? Is there anything else but him to whom you could cling for hope and security and salvation than this one who has given you all things and who has willingly offered himself in your place like this? No. As the hymn we often sing so perfectly summarizes, love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. Amen.